Today, it truly feels like we are all chaotically moving away from a more sane past toward this horrifying future, but the truth is, that future isn't really a future at all. It's more like a return to the past. You will own nothing and be happy. That controversial phrase from 2016 feels truer than ever because in 2026, most can't even afford their rent, let alone buy any type of house, and it increasingly feels like ownership itself is disappearing as everything becomes a subscription, leading some to claim our economy is now resembling feudalism. I mean, the current vice president was completely funded by Thiel, someone who literally believes that the network state is the future, or that medieval-like techno-fiefdoms ruled by CEO dictators are better than democracy. Social media platforms also resemble the feudal systems of the past, where profit isn't derived from a product or service anymore, but from pure ownership, and where we are digital serfs, creating all the value through our data, but getting nothing in return. But this neo-feudalist trend isn't just limited to the obvious. We can also see it with seemingly unrelated things too, like how horror and trauma dominate media now, to why our music is so sad, to the takeover of Nepo babies and the rich romanticizing the poor, even to Hollywood's strange skeletal-like beauty standards. In this video, I want to explain how society isn't collapsing, it's returning. And once you understand just how much our world now mirrors the Middle Ages, you will literally look at society and all the problems that keep you up at night in a completely different way.
But over 1 billion animals have been lost in wildfires.
Elon Musk has become the world's first trillionaire.
Pop music is getting sadder and darker.
I think it's just going to get weirder and weirder and weirder, and finally it's going to be so weird that people are going to have to talk about how weird it is.
A couple of days ago, I was scrolling on Instagram and saw something that was just as f***ed up as it was kinda true. Someone posted all these images of skeletal-looking figures from the Middle Ages and compared them to the Ozempic celebrities we see everywhere today, and while this post was just obviously trying to be an unserious meme, while reading the comments, I did see something interesting. Someone said, it's like cosplaying the middle class isn't enough for them anymore. Now they're going full circle and trying to copy the bodies of the impoverished. Now, while I personally don't think these people are literally trying to mimic anything at all and are probably just suffering from the extreme beauty standards of Hollywood, I still thought this comment was interesting because I think there is a tiny kernel of popular sentiment expressed in it. That the rich increasingly seem so out of touch and detached from reality that it's become surreal, uncanny, and even paradoxically medieval. The extreme plastic surgery, the out-of-touch interviews, even their cosplay of the relatable middle-class person show us the intense disconnect that the wealthy have as inequality just continues to explode. I mean, do you notice how it seems like everyone is a Nepo baby now? It is honestly depressing how it seems like the working class isn't really represented in pop culture anymore, and when we look at the Middle Ages, we can find a direct comparison in the form of something called patronage. The medieval patronage system was a system in which the monarchy, church, or aristocrats were the great patrons of art. In other words, they not only commissioned great works, but they completely funded most of these artists' entire careers. What this meant was that while these funds gave them incredible resources to create some of the most beautiful art in all of human history, it was also only possible because of the rich, and that meant that most of the art in these societies was a direct reflection of an elite minority and no one else. It would be like artists today having to get funds from someone like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos to make art, and once they did, they would have all these new resources, but that art wouldn't be whatever they wanted, it would be what the billionaires wanted. Like, imagine instead of the Catholic Church commissioning giant biblical frescoes, it was Elon Musk wanting statues of himself, or maybe Bezos requesting phallic sculptures of rockets.
But it looks like a giant dick.
Yeah.
Take a look out of starboard. Oh my god, it looks like a huge...
Pecker!
Now, obviously this exact example doesn't exist today
Yet?
But when we look at the entertainment industry, we do see something similar with the continuing consolidation of corporate power in the gatekeepers of culture. You could honestly even argue that what we have today is worse than the patronage system, because back then the artists themselves often came from non-aristocratic backgrounds. Like, they didn't just inherit their professions from their parents, and everyone knew the art they made was funded by and reflective of wealthy elites, while today we are constantly lied to as the rich cosplay as poor or indie to be relatable instead of just being honest. I think of that weird photo shoot Justin Bieber did last year, Tyra Banks' unhinged immersion in homeless culture.
I just want to try to immerse myself as much as possible into the homeless culture.
Even the luxury brands that are going full circle to try and turn tattered clothing into status symbols. It honestly all reminds me of Marie Antoinette's French Hamlet, where she liked to cosplay as a simple peasant farm girl, walking around her rustic theme park-like recreation of a village. Now, to be fair, Marie Antoinette didn't live in the Middle Ages, and this cosplay had more to do with Enlightenment ideas that nature and farm life were the way humans were meant to live in response to rapid urbanization. But wait a minute, does that not sound familiar? With the rise of the trad wife aesthetic and influencers like Nara Smith, we see a similar thing happening. In response to processed foods and the often dystopian nature of the modern technological world, the rich turn to a life that seems simpler, romanticizing not just a working class existence, but the most labor-intensive version of it in the form of farm life. The irony here is that we now live in a world where it seems like only the rich can afford to be poor. Only the wealthy can choose to live this laborious farm life where they spend hours making sprinkles from scratch and consuming all natural ingredients, while the rest of us are far too overworked to often even cook our own food, let alone tend to farm animals for natural ingredients. For most of human history, having others cook for you was the status symbol, but now, with the lack of time the average person has to cook, and with things like fast food and DoorDash, we see an inversion, where being able to prepare your own meals and use all natural ingredients has become the status symbol. And when we again look at how skinny so many people are in Hollywood, I am reminded that heroin chic isn't just back, it's nearly instantaneously achievable with Ozempic, giving you noticeable results in as little as a week. The extreme changes in the wealthy's physical appearances kinda remind me of medieval sumptuary laws, except they've been inverted in really weird ways. In the Middle Ages, the ruling class passed what they called sumptuary laws. Laws that dictated not just what you could wear, but what colors you could own, what fabrics literally touched your skin, or how many jewels you could display. These were intended to prevent what they viewed as immoral societal decay and to enforce a class hierarchy. For example, peasants were restricted to coarse wool, merchants to linen, nobles to silk and velvet, and gold and silver threads were forbidden to anyone below a certain rank. Now, obviously, the biggest difference compared to today is that back then, plumpness meant power. A full figure signaled that you could afford to eat constantly, that you were fed while others starved. What's happening now is the inverse of this, but equally controlling and arguably a more sinister way. The sumptuary law isn't written in legal statute anymore, it's enforced through abstract wealth disparities that limit what most have access to. Today, being thin is now expensive, not because food is scarce, we obviously have food abundance, but because access to healthy foods and even just the luxury of extra time to work out is scarce. Thin in a culture that produces cheap calories requires extra resources and energy. Ozempic costs over $1,000 a month without insurance, and the waiting lists are often years long. Personal trainers cost hundreds per session, cosmetic procedures like buccal fat removal to maintain this new skeletal look cost tens of thousands. Even just the access to quality healthcare are luxury goods restricted to only a certain social group, no different than silk was in 1400. Meanwhile, lower income Americans are disproportionately overweight, not because they lack discipline, but because cheap food is calorie dense and nutrient poor. And what are we all told in response to this? To be body positive. Now, I obviously have nothing against body positivity. I just think it's interesting that it's kind of sold to us as like liberation, while the ones pushing it are using every tool they have to alter their appearance at the slightest change of trends. It's just kind of hypocritical that we are often told to radically accept our flaws by those who treat physical features and even body types like they're disposable. To me, this all just feels like the medieval noble, but in reverse. Instead of proving wealth through abundance, they're proving it through the illusion of scarcity, but with it being voluntary, controlled, and perfectly managed. Only the rich can now afford to look starved. The parallel honestly gets even darker when you look at what comes next. In the Middle Ages, sumptuary laws became increasingly baroque as the merchant class gained wealth and tried to display it. Authorities kept raising the restrictions because the rules kept getting broken because these people had more money and they wanted to show it off. The gap between legal status and actual wealth kept widening until the system collapsed under its own contradictions, and we're kinda heading toward that same moment now. Thinness is becoming the status marker, but thinness requires Ozempic, which is becoming more accessible. If weight loss drugs become cheaper, if insurance starts covering them more easily, if they get democratized in the same way so many pharmaceutical drugs eventually do, then what? They'll probably go back to curves, or they'll move towards something biological that money can still buy. Literal age reversal through stem cell treatments, organ rejuvenation, biological markers of youth that poor people can't access. This is why I kind of think that soon beauty standards will go full circle and being ugly will eventually become the new status symbol. Like, the rich will be the only ones allowed to have natural, unconventional beauty or have unaltered appearances while literally using bioengineering to halt aging. It all comes down to this strange simulated performance the rich are constantly engaged in to mimic things like working class struggle, authenticity, or even just like what we see today with makeup trends that make you look completely natural while still wearing makeup. Now, I know what you're all thinking right now. Hasn't all this stuff always existed? Like, haven't there always been the haves and have-nots, and haven't the rich always used things to signal their status? And the answer to that is yes. Like, fundamentally, yeah, wealth has always been about opportunity. Forget happiness or big houses or nice cars. Wealth gives people the ability to choose things that others just don't get to choose, like choosing to wear nice things or spend your time on a farm or working out and eating all natural. But there was a short period of time when that divide wasn't as great as it is today, when the middle class dominated most aspects of society and politics, and we kind of took it for granted as the rule, not the exception that has to be fought for. Like, the exact reason people point to most of human history and say, well look, the rich have always had all these benefits while the majority didn't, so our current world isn't all that different after all, is the exact evidence that we are returning to the feudal-like way things had operated for millennia. But let's go back to the economic miracle America experienced not that long ago to really see what I mean here. In the 20th century, we truly saw something that had never happened before in human history: the formation and domination of an insanely wealthy middle class. During the peak of the New Deal liberal consensus, the working class had more power in society than ever before, and something called the Great Compression occurred. The wealthy were taxed at rates as high as 90%, and all that extra wealth was redistributed in the form of public services like Social Security, Medicaid, new roads, better schools, and other public works projects. Record high union rates as well as strong market regulations meant the average person's wages were higher and stronger than ever before, while healthy manufacturing sectors meant goods and services were extremely cheap. I mean, this was the time when an entire family could survive on a single income and homes could be bought from a Sears catalog. Like, imagine being able to order an affordable home from Amazon today. Popular culture was also invented in this time, and most of the musicians and bands we saw came from a working class background, meaning the average person was represented in culture more than literally any other time in human history. Today, we live in a world where this weird celebrity status billionaires have and their unapologetic flaunting of wealth seems like it has always existed, but in the 20th century, that kinda became taboo. Not only were there just fewer ultra-wealthy people in general because of taxes, but there was also this cultural aversion the super rich had to flaunting wealth or publicly influencing society like we see today, and these people tended to live private lives mostly out of the public eye. So yes, the wealthy have always existed, but there was a brief time, not that long ago, when not only was inequality just not as bad as it is today, but there was also a belief that flaunting wealth was a bad look, and the middle class dominated most aspects of culture. Now we seem to be seeing a regression to a world before that. But all those things are easy. Like, they're all issues we all know society has, and they're conversations we've been having for a while now. I think what is really fascinating about this all is what happens when we understand that none of these things are really happening in isolation. They're all connected to much bigger, darker trends that are literally going to shock you with just how much they resemble the Middle Ages. Like, this next part of the video is going to blow your mind. I have a foreboding of an America in my children's or grandchildren's time when the United States is a service and information economy, when nearly all the manufacturing industries have slipped away to other countries, when awesome technological powers are in the hands of a very few,
Elon Musk has bought Twitter,
and no one representing the public interest can even grasp the issues.
Fake news. You're fake news.
When the people have lost the ability to set their own agendas or knowledgeably question those in authority.
Senator, I'm Singaporean. No.
When, clutching our crystals and nervously consulting our horoscopes, our critical faculties in decline.
Gen Z is the first generation in modern history to underperform us on basically every cognitive measure we have, from basic attention.
Unable to distinguish between what feels good and what's true, we slide, almost without noticing, back into superstition and darkness. That was Carl Sagan from his now prophetic 1995 book, The Demon-Haunted World: Science as a Candle in the Dark. This quote has been used time and time again, usually as a visionary example of the rise of anti-intellectualism in America, but I actually think it's much bigger than just that. I think what Carl Sagan is really predicting here is the slow destruction of the modern era itself and the values that built our advanced civilization. Science, empiricism, critical thinking, democracy, rule of law, the idea of a collective good at all, are rapidly being dismantled thanks to unimaginable wealth inequality and destabilizing communication technologies that prioritize engagement over truth. Now, it's important to note that history isn't as linear as we like to believe, but I think we really do take the 20th century for granted. It's like we did see a pretty substantial period, at least in the West, where civil rights, technology, science, wealth, even cultural trends seem to progress linearly. I mean, for a good chunk of time, politicians kept religion mostly out of politics, and there was a real move away from magical thinking, at least in the way policies were made around expertise in empiricism instead of misinformation, corporate interference, or religion. It really seemed like progress was linear, that logic and reason had won, that the world was no longer seen as magical or mysterious, and that everything was explainable by science. It's like, you ever hear people complain that they were born too late to experience the age of exploration, or born too early for the space age, or just that they feel science has so sufficiently exposed our natural world that wonder and enchantment seem completely lost? It's this idea that we are now completely and forever removed from the past thanks to technology and science that our modern world is currently challenging.
I think it's just going to get weirder and weirder and weirder, and finally it's going to be so weird that people are going to have to talk about how weird it is. I look for the invention of artificial life, the cloning of human beings, possible contact with extraterrestrials, possible human immortality, and at the same time, appalling acts of brutality, genocide, race baiting, homophobia, famine, starvation. Eventually people are going to say, what the hell is going on?
Contemporary public life increasingly feels claustrophobic, faintly hallucinatory, where what we know as real feels like sand shifting under our feet. The First Lady, Melania Trump, walks a humanoid robot down a White House red carpet and later tells the audience to imagine a future humanoid educator named Plato. A former intelligence official testifies under oath that the United States has been secretly retrieving and reverse engineering crashed UFOs for decades and that non-human biologics have been recovered. demonic vexation, teleportation, increased interest in religious practice, those phenomenon are all signs that life feels, to many, increasingly charged with unseen forces. You might say it has been re-enchanted. There's a widespread feeling that the material explanation is no longer sufficient, that something uncanny, maybe even numinous, is diffused into the texture of ordinary American life. In 1917, the sociologist Max Weber argued that a long process of rationalization, culminating in modernity, was eliminating, quote, mysterious, incalculable forces from the world. Science would explain, technology would master, and magic would disappear. For a brief stretch of modern history, he seemed right. The enduring human instinct to believe in the otherworldly declined as empiricism, common evidentiary standards, and for the shortest period of all, mass media produced a rough consensus about what was real. Now, we seem to be sliding back. That was a quote from a New York Times article by Katja Ungerman, where she argues things like anti-intellectualism, social media's mass information, and the resurgence of religion and superstition mirror a return to the Middle Ages in the form of the re-enchantment of society, where so many things now seem possible again, and material explanations increasingly feel suspect. Ever since I read that article, I couldn't stop thinking about it, not because I never really thought about the things she talks about in it, but because it helped me complete this idea I've had for a while now. It's a bit complex, but stay with me here because you're going to need all the context to grasp what I am trying to say, and once you do, everything from why artists like Ariana Grande and Doja Cat are suddenly obsessed with horror, to the rise of mental illness and the feeling that the world is ending, will make sense. So, if any of you have been following my channel for a while now, you might know that in the beginning, I talked a lot about artists like Lana Del Rey, or Ethel Cain, or even Grimes. When I first started this channel, I was making all kinds of videos, and one day I just happened to make one about Lana Del Rey, which exploded, and so I started a series about her where I talked about Tumblr sad girl culture, romanticism and philosophy, and just the trends of the 90s throughout the 2010s. What was so interesting was that over time, completely by accident, I began to notice something about society and art. It seems like ever since the 2000s, there has been this trend where angst, despair, and sadness have become the dominant forces shaping culture. Music has increasingly become centered around loss and angst, and mental health disorders have never been higher. As time went on, I began to connect this to the fact that horror-adjacent imagery seems weirdly everywhere in music now. There was Lil Nas X, Billie Eilish, Doja Cat, Lady Gaga, and now even Ariana Grande in her newest album, Petal. As I made more and more videos on these topics, I would find myself always coming back to these three causes: postmodernism, neoliberalism, and social media. Postmodernism is basically the philosophical era we are currently in, even though some now argue we are in metamodernism, but that's a topic for another video. And it helps to explain everything from media, humor, politics, literature, and even the way you view yourself and the world. It helps explain why everything in our society is so influenced by irony, skepticism, intertextuality, subjectivism, and above all, a rejection of grand narratives. It's basically why everything is a reference of a reference now, why everyone seems so performative, it's why simulation seems more important than what's actually real, and most of all, it's why so many people feel like nothing matters anymore, or that they don't even know what's real because media has become so infinite. In the previous modern era, the grand narrative was inevitable progress toward an eventual utopia. In other words, with the Renaissance and humanism, democracy, capitalism, scientific and industrial revolutions, human society would continually be improved and progress was linear. Optimism dominated and the future was seen as exciting. With postmodernism, all that basically collapsed and optimism, cynicism, and nihilism began to coexist all at the same time. Some people believed the future was bright, others felt we were doomed, some just gave up paying attention altogether because nothing mattered anymore. In other words, there wasn't this grand agreed upon idea that dominated society, and constant contradiction born from an endless stream of media took over. I know that might seem kinda abstract to those who don't really pay attention or care about philosophy, but the simple thing here is that we now live in a society where there isn't one guiding belief that dominates everything anymore. Postmodernism is simply the decentralization and deconstruction of ideas, beliefs, and the objective truths of the past. So you combine that with neoliberalism decimating the economic conditions of those in the West, leading to incredible wealth inequality, and then social media, which is just built on throwing every problem imaginable in our face while also flooding us with so much information, and then the unprecedented destruction American politicians are inflicting on the world, and it all leads us to not only feel like we are in a constant state of grief, but also that there is now something we can all agree on. Collapse is the only thing that feels certain. Broligarchs hell-bent on turning the most powerful country in the world into a corporate dictatorship, social media turning us all against each other and truth itself, capitalism burning our planet to the ground. It truly feels like no matter what political side you are on, no matter where you live, no matter what language you speak, the end feels near and the future couldn't seem more dark. In this way, what we find in the popularity of all these horror films, constant expose culture, rise in anti-intellectualism, extreme institutional distrust, and the popularity of art that reflects our collective despair and trauma, is a sense that collapse has become the new grand narrative. It's even starting to feel like we've entered a new era. The era of end modernism, where all the beliefs, institutions, and ideologies of the modern era are systemically being dismantled as social media strips our civilization of liberal values in favor of unrelenting negativity, division, misinformation, magical thinking, and authoritarianism. Postmodernism allowed dissent and constant contradiction to flourish, but today it is starting to feel like our problems are so numerous and existential, and our disconnection from each other and even a shared reality is atomizing us into these algorithmic village-like tribes that it truly does feel like hopeless. Right now, this idea I have is obviously in its infancy, and I'm sure a bunch of people who know way more about everything can find ways to argue it's wrong. But when I do think about like what the most likely future is, I see a time when it's obvious. I see a future where the extremely wealthy live in luxury space stations or maybe even in utopian planetary colonies, while Earth has become one giant impoverished ghetto as we see the concept of white flight but on a global scale. I see a climate crisis where entire cities are abandoned due to sea level rise as billions migrate inland and crops fail as climatic patterns shift. I see our modern standard of living that we've all grown so accustomed to, as well as the institutions and democracies that built it, continuing to decay, devolving into incapable monarchy-like walled kingdoms, in the same way the fall of the Roman Empire led to nearly 8,000 years of regression before the Renaissance. So when I read that New York Times article, I felt that someone had finally put words to this idea I've had for a while now, but also that instead of everything just collapsing in this linear way toward a state of nothing, it was more like everything was instead regressing to a period before modernism that increasingly resembles the Middle Ages. We all see how much upheaval and damage social media is doing to society, and it leads many of us to feel untethered and worried about where this is all headed. But we've actually seen this happen before, about 600 years ago with the printing press. Before the printing press, the church held a monopoly on information. They controlled what got written, what got read, and what people knew about the world. Knowledge was scarce, gatekept, and that scarcity gave them power. When Gutenberg invented the printing press in 1440, it didn't just make books cheaper, it shattered the entire information hierarchy. Suddenly, anyone with some money could access texts that were previously forbidden. The Bible got printed in vernacular languages instead of Latin. Heretical ideas started circulating, and scientific papers spread without church approval. The monopoly on consensus broke. This led to informational chaos and an explosion of decentralization, the Reformation, wars over ideology, complete social destabilization, as people suddenly had access to all these competing versions of truth and no central authority to tell them which one was right. Social media did the exact same thing, just faster and weirder. For most of human history, information was controlled by gatekeepers. Newspapers, TV stations, publishing houses, and journalists and editors decided what stories mattered, what got amplified, and also what stayed hidden. And yes, while this centralized gatekeeping led to the ability to abuse that power, it also led to the institutionalization of fact-checking and research. Television stations and journalists couldn't just say whatever they wanted, they had rules and regulations. Then, social media gave everyone their own printing press in their pocket. Suddenly, a random person could reach millions of views, and misinformation spread faster than truth because the truth was expensive and lies were cheap. This is because the truth takes a lot of resources and energy to discover, and it's often so complex and layered that it's boring compared to a simple, inflammatory lie. Television did what social media has made exponential, and competing narratives are so abundant now that it can be hard to really believe what's real at times, and this isn't even factoring in AI. The printing press took 200 years to stabilize into new power structures, and social media has only been destabilizing us for 15 years. So, when you understand what the printing press did to Europe with hundreds of years of religious wars, that doesn't make our future look all that great with social media. And I mean, when we do look at AI, social media actually doesn't look that bad in comparison. Social media steals data and personal information, but AI is attempting to steal the entirety of human knowledge, culture, talent, art, jobs, and then sell it all back to us in the form of, you guessed it, subscriptions.
Data is the last frontier of colonization. They took our land and then tried to sell it back to us. And now they're taking our data and trying to sell it back to us as a service.
While social media resembles feudalism, AI resembles colonialism from the digital to the physical. Unfathomable amounts of human data and labor in the form of model training are being stolen without permission or payment around the planet, and data centers are like mini colonies springing up in the most vulnerable small towns around America to take advantage of public services like cheap water and electricity. I'm reminded of early American settlements, or the modern Israeli ones, which take over indigenous lands for their abundant resources while decimating the environment and local populations in the process. It's honestly insane that the modern fascist right complains so much about the threat of socialism today, when socialism has actually always existed in America. It's just that it's only for the rich instead of everyone else. The lower 99% consistently have their wealth redistributed to the top 0.001% in the form of tax cuts, government bailouts, and subsidies. But hey, capitalism might have its downsides, but at least we all get the chance to participate and potentially even own our own property and businesses, right? Well, if you have spent any time online lately, you might have seen the rise in something called subscription memes. These are those memes about how everyday items like your car or fridge or even bed will eventually need a subscription to use. And obviously these memes are funny as fuck, but I think there is also some truth in them. I remember when subscriptions first came out and they were an option sold alongside physical media. Like, they were seen as these innovative alternatives that just made everything more convenient. I mean, why drive all the way to a store to buy a physical DVD of something when you could just pay a fee and download it instantly to your computer? And the best part was that you could also get updates installed instantly instead of having to go to the store again and buy the newer product. But the thing is, this only really works when there are other options and competition. Competition encourages lowering prices and offering the consumer with more features, but once a monopoly forms, or once the majority of things become subscriptions, now there are no more options for us to choose from, and prices skyrocket while quality plummets. And because updates are now instant and these apps function on an algorithmic black box, companies can force us to pay for an upgrade while the service we originally bought, which had no problems, suddenly starts glitching and doesn't work anymore until we upgrade. I mean, it's one thing if we at least owned these services and they just naturally stopped working over time because, newer computers inevitably advance so much that older software eventually might not be compatible. But we don't even own these things anymore, and so we are trapped in this predatory cycle of forced upgrades while quality declines and there's nothing we can do about it. Another way to think about all this is the concept of enshitification. Enshitification is a term coined by writer Cory Doctorow to describe how digital platforms decay. First, platforms are good to users to lock us in, then they abuse users to benefit business customers like advertisers, and finally, they then abuse those advertisers to claw back all value for themselves, leaving a useless shell of a service. Think about how early Instagram or TikTok were so peak, but now are so dominated by ads and subscriptions and influencers trying to sell you something that it feels like they are completely ruined, but so many people are now so addicted that they can't really stop using them. Enshitification perfectly helps explain the modern subscription apocalypse where consumers own nothing and pay endlessly. But perhaps nothing explains our modern society more than Yanis Varoufakis' concept of techno-feudalism. You've probably noticed how the modern internet now feels less like an open source of free knowledge and more like a collection of massive walled kingdoms. That is the core idea behind techno-feudalism, the theory that big tech companies have essentially turned the global economy back into the Middle Ages. Instead of traditional capitalism where companies compete by making and selling actual products, tech giants now make their billions simply by owning the digital territory. They are the new lords, and the digital platforms they own, like Amazon, Apple, or Google, are their fiefdoms. But if tech giants are the lords, then what does that make us? Well, in this sort of system, we are essentially the digital peasants. In the medieval days, serfs didn't own the land, they toiled on it, gave a massive cut of their harvest to the lord, and received basic protection in return. Today, every time you post a video, write a tweet, upload a photo, or leave a comment, you are generating free data that makes these platforms vastly wealthier. We don't get paid for the value we create, instead we pay a digital rent just to exist online, while algorithmic lords dictate the rules of our labor and survival. This shift shows us that our modern world is moving away from free market capitalism and backward toward a system of rent and monopolies. In the 19th and 20th centuries, capitalism was about factories, profits, and wages. Today, techno-feudalism is about cloud capital, rent-seeking, and behavioral control. We live under the illusion of infinite choice, but we are ultimately trapped within a handful of massive digital estates. It's really insane when you think about it because it's like we have all been led to believe that the internet made so many things free through all this unlimited access because we are just unable to truly perceive how much our data is being used and harvested and just how valuable it is. That is the real price of using these services, and it's ironic because it is our data. So not only should we not have to pay for anything on these apps, but they should be paying us to use them since they are getting so much out of us. But I honestly think the scariest part about everything we are talking about is how hellbent so many billionaires are on literally bringing back the age of fiefdoms in the form of network states. The network state is basically this concept developed by Silicon Valley billionaires who believe that democracy is ill-equipped for the challenges and technologies of the future, so they advocate for this idea of forming small states from scratch that are often ruled by CEO dictators, which run on cryptocurrency, and which eventually gain full sovereignty and recognition by other nation-states around the world.
They have this idea, largely stemming from this Sovereign Individual book, that technology means democracy is an obsolete software system, that the United States is an obsolete country, that it won't survive the 21st century. Some call it the network state. Curtis Yarvin called it patchworks. Part of their apocalyptic vision for the future is that the country will be broken up. It will no longer be one country. It'll be broken up into these sort of corporate zones or fiefdoms called patchworks or network states. And the new governing structure will be these autocratic, dictator-like corporations that will have total power over their citizens. Yarvin wrote that they could even turn unproductive people into biodiesel to fuel city buses. But he said he was just kidding about that, but that what we really need for the poor is an humane alternative to genocide.
So in other words, billionaires are so brilliant that they reinvented the medieval fiefdom but think it's some novel idea. What I find so scary about this is that we can actually see this ideology being represented in mainstream politics today. It's why someone like Elon Musk was allowed to act as a CEO dictator on day one and illegally dismantle government programs without congressional approval. It's why someone like J.D. Vance, who was completely funded by Peter Thiel, was chosen as the vice president. When you understand this authoritarian, feudal-like fervor that is coming out of Silicon Valley, what we see in American politics today then makes a lot more sense. Like, these people aren't just incompetent and that's why they're destroying everything. The destruction is the whole point, to accelerate a sort of CEO king to be installed so he can run the country like a business instead of a democracy. Curtis Yarvin is another influential person in the idea of the nation state, and he literally, actively, openly advocates for the return of monarchy and authoritarianism and points to corporations in China as examples of why democracy doesn't work.
let's debunk this concept of liberal democracy. There's actually no such thing. Democracy in today's world just means a good or legitimate government. It means a claim to a legitimate government. Just because you call yourself a democracy doesn't mean anything. North Korea calls itself the DPRK, Democratic People's Republic of Korea. That is 3 euphemisms for democracy, 1 place name, and it's a monarchy. Anything that works is a monarchy.
He calls his ideas the Dark Enlightenment, or the belief that things like democracy, rule of law, separation of powers, critical thinking, and liberalism should be replaced with authoritarianism and anti-egalitarian values. Some other concepts of the Dark Enlightenment include a rejection of the idea that history naturally moves towards more freedom and fairness, and they argue that democracy leads to social decay, inefficiency, and political corruption. They believe that only business leaders are smart or worthy enough to lead everybody else, and it is literally just the reintroduction of divine right, but with wealth being that divine justification. So when you take all the things we've talked about in this video, from the appearances of the rich and the romanticization of peasant life to techno-feudalism and CEO monarchs, we find that our society isn't just accidentally mirroring a past feudal Europe, but that there are incredibly powerful people who are actively working every single day to bring us closer to a world like it before the ideas of democracy and individual rights dominated society. It's all connected, and it's a lot more literal than you probably thought before clicking on this video. Now, I know all this information probably makes you feel so incredibly worried and even overwhelmed, and that's because it should. To really help you all understand the gravity of what we are dealing with here, I can't just ignore our reality and simply offer some feel-good quick solution. It is really bad, and these people have already done so much damage to society. Like, you should be extremely worried and concerned. But guess what? Just like we've seen feudal Europe before, we've also been in a time when the world literally felt like it was ending. When you look at the art and culture from the world wars, I mean, it was bad. These events broke people's minds and faiths, and not just in society or progress, but even just in the goodness of humanity itself for decades. And yet, things not only got better, but about 20 years later, we saw the golden age of capitalism and the second American founding with the expansion of civil rights. It's never over until it's over, and if nothing else, at least we're far more aware today. If you haven't already, I suggest reading Democracy Awakening by Heather Cox Richardson and subscribing to her YouTube channel because she kind of explains all this far better than I can. When we look at the overwhelming problems in society today, it is important to understand that none of these things happened overnight. Like, Trump didn't just create them in 2016. Everything we see happening was the result of deliberate policy choices that occurred over like 60 years while the majority of people slept through the warnings and completely checked out. The Southern strategy, Reagan's trickle-down policies, the left moving center-right in the 90s, Bush creating the modern surveillance state and expanding executive power, Obama's military strikes without congressional approval, the legitimization of genocidal fascism. All these things helped get us exactly to where we are today, and when you actually understand history, you will see Trump is both a cause and a symptom of decades of policy and ideology, and he really is just like neoliberalism taken to the extreme. I think today we are all just so aware of everything, and it's why Heather named her book Democracy Awakening, because Trump was the wake-up call. Knowledge is power, and I almost feel like, in the tiniest of ways, that we needed a second unrestrained Trump term to finally wake up privileged non-minority Americans to see that fascism can happen anywhere, and that we need a New Deal-like movement that offers real change to combat it, not the do-nothing centrism of the past. And I mean, there are also some serious advantages we have today compared to the past. For one, most of the population was illiterate and information just wasn't as widely available. They also didn't have the Enlightenment, which seared the values of equality, justice, individual rights, or a separation of powers into us all. Now, I know what you're thinking. Well, yeah, we might hear about these values all the time, but I mean, look around the world. Look at Trump. Look at this entire video. Most don't even follow them. And to that, I would say, yes, that's true. But the awareness of contradiction itself is what is significant. We often take these values for granted in the West, but they are incredibly powerful. Like, the founders knew this, and dictators all over the world also know this, which is why they fight tooth and nail to suppress them. I mean, the civil rights movement and even just the push to end slavery were people just striving to faithfully fulfill those values because of the contradictions, not despite them. In other words, because we are all mostly raised to believe in these liberal values of freedom and justice for all, we are then more sensitive to injustice in the world, which leads us to fight to make our societies better. Like, yeah, that fight might be long, and it can be unbearable to see such atrocities everywhere, but the very fact that we don't just accept it and still strive toward a more perfect society makes us so different from literally any other time in human history. Like, I really don't think people appreciate this fact enough. Back then, people would see horrific, immoral, unimaginable things every day, but guess what? Social hierarchies were ingrained in their minds, and these values that everyone is equal, or that we should want a more equitable world, or that even just progress itself was a thing, didn't exist. The exact fact that we are raised to believe America is this exceptional place, yet we constantly point out all the ways it's not, shows us that even when these liberal values are so obviously ignored, just the awareness of them leads us to never settle and relentlessly fight for change. Do you think anyone in Great Depression America could have ever imagined the prosperity and reform that would arrive like just 15 years later? In the 19th century, most Americans thought the wealthy elite slave owners would win the Civil War and export their system not just to the North, but also around the world. I mean, America was literally built on slavery, and the fact that we don't have it anymore is one of the biggest accomplishments I look to give me hope, because if there's anything I would have never expected to happen when understanding the people who formed this country, it would be the abolishment of slavery, yet here we are. I just believe that things usually have to get really, really bad before they get better. And all I can say is do not give up, and to know nothing is ever set in stone. Societies change all the time when all hope seems lost. It's just that these changes are often born from crisis. And if there's anything we know for sure, it's that today we are in crisis.